Hello everyone, today we talk about Gallienus' army and more specifically of his alleged reform of the Roman army proper that, as we will see today, in spite of the changes that surely happened under his reign, but also others, previously and before, had already, started as a broader transformation of the Roman military from, it's even difficult to state since when, right? We will address actually the matter of the vexillations and the problem how these are conceived, generally speaking, and simply seeing also how the historiographical myth of the creation of a permanent force of solely mounted troops stationed in Milan is actually an historiographical invention in some way, and that surely reflects, once again, important changes at some level, but should be contextualized better in Gallienus' reign and his specific, mostly strategical needs, right? And there are just a couple of myths to debunk that today are actually widely renowned in historiography, but that somewhat spread in the imaginary, but not so much. And this is not also something to be particularly happy of, simply because people don't give a damn about the Roman army after the first or second century AD most of the times, or even much previously to that. And the third century is the terrible thing where everything went downhill, and the Roman army went to this abyss. Well, it doesn't matter that the 4th century Roman army, as we've seen multiple times, was the strongest military machine that Rome had ever created. But leave aside that, which always cause a bit of malaise, because that instead is a very deeply rooted conviction that unfortunately is very difficult to eradicate. But this is, at least we've made a couple of videos specifically about the transformation of the Roman legionnaire, right? Mostly the infantryman, but actually we made a video specifically from the transformation of the Roman legionary infantryman from the 3rd, I think, to the 5th century, right? But we've never addressed actually Constantinian army, and at some point we will have to cover an overwhelming amount of stuff, and that tens of videos to tell it all just about that. So what's the point with Gallienus here? Gallienus, Roman Emperor, 253-268. And to him, it has been commonly attributed the creation of a markedly mobile force, right, that substantially would have been more stable and permanent compared to the ones previously used, right, so before mid-3rd century. And in such institution is often even spotted a sort of anticipation of those permanent mobile troops, that is, the comitatenses, typical of the Constantinian and post-Constantinian period. So the question, I don't know whether in the very recent years, but at least up to fairly like 10 years ago, was still a topic of debate. United to also another traditionally referred aspect of Gallienus' mobile force. In fact, it's been often stated that this force was based almost exclusively on a sort of monolithic block of sole cavalry, right? Permanently stationed in Milan in the role of independent strategic reserves, ready to intervene promptly in the areas of crisis. This commonplace of the transfer of the role of principal arm of the Roman army from infantry to cavalry is born and eventually developed in historiography from the debatable considerations of Cedrenus. There was a 12th century Byzantine chronicler that stated how Gallienus had been, quote, the first to establish the essentially battalions or regiments, the term is tagmata, right, in his own time, of cavalry, right? The tagmata in the 12th century Roman Empire were solely cavalry units, right? So the author was, tracing this parallelism in contraposition to the fact that, quote, again, previously the infantry had made up the majority of Roman soldiers, right? This is the first book, 454, so if you want to find Cedrenus' reference. And however, similar conclusions, besides being scarcely supported by the sources, are at this point of historiography considered as essentially speculative at best, and also scarcely plausible. We look at Nicaise, Campbell, Farrell, etc. They all express this judgment. So, in the period in which it's been hypothesized the existence of the Milanese mounted reserve are in fact attested, especially by epigraphical and numismatic sources, also many infantry vexillations, right, collected as usual from the legions deployed along the frontiers and gathered, unified in different relevant strategical seats, essentially besides the frontier or even further inland into the imperial territory. And it is therefore certain that in the general picture of this wider mobile force, the mounted component, albeit being significantly more relevant compared to the traditional composition of the Roman armies of the previous centuries, kept to coexist and to cooperate with a prevalent infantry component. And to stretch this further, frankly, I can't think of a single example of solely mounted armies, right, in the sedentary world for basically throughout all history in that regard. Even when heavy cavalry was uncontrasted as such, was decisive regularly on the field during the 12th, 13th century, and also in the centuries, the central centuries of the Middle Ages, was the core around which the same armies were organized. That infantry was excluded, or it was not prevalent numerically speaking. Right. This is not even, but up to the 11th, the early 12th century, in Western Europe, cavalry wasn't even properly decisive over infantry. You still find lots of properly of the, it's not just the numbers, right? We're talking specifically of its own strength, and this naturally, however, being with the infantry being regularly larger, greater in number than cavalry, right? So today we are not going to discuss, broadly speaking, the history of the rise of mounted warfare in late Roman times, which is, as we have seen even from here, it's actually true, right? But it was never like, as it's been stated famously, infantry remains the queen of battles, right? And even in those conditions in which objectively cavalry seems to have gained a greater importance, think about during the 6th century, right? That even there, certain historiographers went as far as to look at, Belisarius' army, seeing that infantry was very scarce or non-present, but even if there was not so important, it's actually an excess, and we should always judge case by case. We should also get acquainted to the fact that different eras have different historiographical standards, right? And it happens, and I can tell you because I work constantly on this, that there are times in the Middle Ages in which the chroniclers count just the cavalry, right? And that doesn't mean that there wasn't infantry together but attached with them, or that even it wasn't important, right? So we should always maintain eyes open, and not only, right, mostly the mind open, to the fact that, of course, infantry and cavalry throughout all this period were indispensable for one another, right? Just steppes peoples of Eurasia, the nomadic populations had armies that were prevalently composed, or at least had this major core of decisive core of cavalrymen. But even in there, the steppes weren't first of all alike. There were also important infantries in the steppes, important complements in this regard that are usually overlooked, especially from the migration era. And unfortunately, there has been a bit this idea that from late Roman times, it's cavalry, right? And infantry, as if it declined, right? Go ask, in fact, as what we mentioned before, the Constantine armies, what infantry really was at the time, and against which other infantries and cavalries it had to cope with, right? Successfully, by the way. The same Gallienus crushed, for example, the Alamanni, famously, in Italy. But we're talking about populations that from this time onwards, the great confederacies or of the Germans in Central Europe, or the the Sassanids on the eastern border, these were becoming much more dangerous enemies that the ones Rome had ever seen, right? And part of this because they were developing sometimes even in parallel with the same Roman army. Not just, of course, the equipment was all hybrid, right? And there was an enormous share among all peoples but way before than this, like there's never been a distinctive, weapon that has been attached to one people or to one ethnicity. And if it was, on average, it's because that reflected a specific context that can't be loosely, isolated, let's say, sampled from other areas. But if you look at material culture, archaeology in the ancient world, very often you can't tell who's who. This is very true even for an army like the Roman one that was uniformed according to certain criteria, but used some of the most diverse equipments and their improvement in their interaction ever, and especially the use of combined forces, that in a moment of crisis, exactly this century and the pressure of these enemies on the borders, were obliged by necessity, and war is a constant rationale in this regard, to invest on quality, right? The proper improvements in the quality of Roman equipment and warfare passed through these years here, right? And that's why, I opened by, of course, blaming whoever thinks that the Constantinian army was less of a military system to, I don't know, the early imperial one, for example, which is not just a gross underestimation, but by these times, historiographical acknowledgments, just a pretty grotesque thing to even come up with. But aside from this, and this is not to say even that, of course, every reality has its own context, right? So it's not a race between, what was better, what was worse, right? It's simply, enormously complex system that need to find viable solutions with what they have, right? And we mostly talk about medieval history in Schwerpunkt. Part of the reason why we talk more, we haven't covered already certain topics like this, that every time I make an ancient warfare video, I come up with this digressions. It's also because I make less of ancient warfare, but we will cover this hopefully intensively and extensively, and I don't think I will be leaving enough before finishing all the stuff we have to say about this. Just for saying that, it's not a matter of personal opinion, right? If I make a statement about this stuff, it's not because to trigger you or to prove that I'm more intelligent than the others or other stuff. I tell you because it's what we have acknowledged at this point in history on the base of extensive documentary and archaeological evidence, so that you should at least be acquainted to the broader historiography of it, if you at least want to have a say in the thing. Because otherwise, what do historians work for? For people not caring about it? This is a great problem we have, socially speaking, that everybody thinks that his own opinion matters. Unfortunately, not. Right? The opinion of a specialist matters. That one of other people may matter if they prove that they have at least enough confidence as much as the specialist. Otherwise, it doesn't. Right? But aside from this, and this is just a methodological and a deontological reflection, but there would be a lot of other considerations, for example, to make under the epistemological level. Everything is being, found in properly the mistake in which we have framed certain realities, and also how that has nothing to do with moral relativism whatsoever, or a rewriting from scratch of all the things we have acknowledged, right? Which people seem to take the chance for claiming to think that they can rise to the top of specialists, which is not really the case. Among other things, we should stress other basic matters. For example, the only idea of a cavalry force, of a solely cavalry force, is incompatible with what we know about the speed of march of greater contingents, right? Think about logistics, right? We must remember that cavalry possesses a higher speed of march over infantry only on short tracks, right? If the march starts surpassing the 4 or 5 days, infantry marches with the same types of cavalry, right? And here we're not talking about nomadic armies that were specialized, even with specific horse breeds to carry, all the stuff, heavy loads, having, even the capacity of going through certain climates, certain realities. Here we're talking about enormous systems, logistical systems of supplying wagons, all the attendants, systems that even for cavalry needed specifically that, and they needed that simply because cavalry was not tactically independent on the field. Right? If this had been just a cavalry unit, it would have been in trouble. That's not how sedentary armies fought. Right? And even more interestingly, after 7-8 days of march, infantry covers the same distance of cavalry even in less time than mounted troops. Right? Junkelmann studied these aspects from experimental archaeology. He knew definitely what he was talking about. So the greater speed of a cavalry contingent compared to an infantry one or a mixed one in general has therefore a tactical value, mostly on the battlefield, and not in a strategical sense, if not just on short distances, right, in terms of a few tens of kilometers. But from a strategical point of view, especially to fill the gaps now that we're opening in the frontier, these Germanic invasions on the Danube, on the Rhine, on that scale, cavalry's mobility is not to be exploited. And it is in this sense that the Milanese mounted contingent that did exist, right, but has to be framed, right? And its existence, by the way, was also suggested by Zosimus and from numismatic sources. It remains, surely, anyway, a significant element, if anything, as another witness of the evolution of the modalities of management and employment of cavalry that, however, had started already way before Gallienus' times, right? The practice to unify integrally mounted contingents within the the context of a wider mobile force results to have been applied recurrently already since the time of Septimius Severus, with the aim to favor the flexibility of its own troops at a tactical level and to allow quick and decisive interventions on the battlefield. Right? This is what also Cassius Dio says explicitly in 75-74 and 76-68 of his history. And this is, by the way, one of those hints of that tactical improvement, the sophistication we're talking, and would take full form in Constantinian times. We're not talking specifically about, as we'll see now, also how the Romans had dealt with auxiliary forces in the first place. Right here, we're talking chiefly about the legionary organic, but think about the numeri, for example, all of these units that, especially from this time, we made that video about the Simmacari under Caracalla, right? The fact that the Roman army now is recruiting ever more frequently from across the border because the general demilitarization of the Roman population, the impoverishment of the middle class, etc., had rendered cheaper this measure of recruitment of peoples that were already warlike because they were fighting all the day long among each other, and that therefore could eventually even be settled within the Roman lands to be diluted with the rest of the population, and solving the demographic crisis was taking place in here. But we talked about this stuff the other day, incidentally, but it's all part of a picture that actually makes a lot of sense. But not only that, it's witnessed in many other historical contexts, right? In fact, if you really want to find the first traces of such transformation, you can easily spot them already since the 2nd century AD. Right? Since Trajan's times, for example, it's witnessed a vexillatio equito Illyricum, which was properly constituted for the Dacian wars. It was transformed into a numerus equitum electorum ex Illyricum. Right? So this is very interesting because it's a vexillatio, so the etymology, it comes from vexillum, so the idea that these were units, like in Greek the semaiophoros, right? There are units under that same vexillum that eventually here, and of Illyrian cavalry, and now we will see also the role of the Illyrians, the Dalmata and so on. and that becomes numerus equitum electorum, so of actually chosen cavalry, right? Ex Illyricum, from Illyricum, right? And this unit was still active by 140 AD, right? So, a generation after the Dacian Wars, and this was regularized eventually as a unit in the Ala Prima Nova Illyricum. So this was a unit that doesn't matter how it had come to be constituted fundamentally, but it was eventually to create an ala, right, of auxiliaries in this regard that would remain a unit on their own, and that it all began as a detachment. So we already see something very interesting that had started taking place from this regular detachments of troops that stem naturally from the military practice of the organization of grouping. We should make a video actually how we think about Roman legions as certain monarchs that were more or less always in the same size and same as if they were somewhat independent. But of course, in the major campaigns like the Trajan Wars, these were grouped again in the way they were supplied, etc. Came together, the equipments, even the ways the relative provinces where these troops were stationed, participated properly, not just with these troops, but properly at an administrative level in terms of command, chain of command, how the transfer occurred. It's not easy, right? And we don't know, unfortunately, very much, but we should be very much open to the fact of considering a much more flexible trend than just the more typically standardized forms and numbers that we read for the sake of didactic clarity, but about which we know dramatically few. We don't know much about the Roman army. We don't know, right? And we're lucky that the Roman Empire even existed for us to have this enormous source of information that, however, still is, in absolute terms, is still very low after all. Right? So at the beginning of the 3rd century, the weight, let's say, of cavalry within the Roman military machine was therefore already growing manner compared to the early empire. However, contrarily to what is stated by a common and in fact wrong commonplace, infantry, of course, still constituted steadily the backbone of the Roman armies, right? Even an adequately powered cavalry force was capable to act on the battlefield with autonomous contingents, the vexillations equitum, in fact, necessarily continued to operate within the context of a very close tactical cooperation with infantry. Vegetius, in a passage which is book 2, 6, that is generally considered relative, in fact, to the 3rd century Roman legion, declared that the mounted component of the legion was 226 men strong, while for the early empire, as we know, the numerical consistency of legionary cavalry was, on paper at least, equal to only 120 men. We see, for example, Flavius Josephus, the Jewish War, book 3, 120. And also in here, we should always point out, by the way, that of course, legionary contingents were also the auxiliary ones, very often were much more, not only were integrated with the Roman legion in that fashion we were saying before, so that a Roman army was multiple legions, multiple auxiliary wings and cohorts, right? So that's the system, how it worked on the field, right? The administrative divisions are, were still important at a tactical level, but there wasn't, the armies are wherever they are constituted, as you know, they get all, I can't say messed up, but blended together for major campaigns. There are lots of recruits coming from everywhere, other mercenaries, local liabilities, militias, etc. We don't have to think about, the exclusivity of, wargamistically speaking, of that prefix, just even number of troops, right? What do we know after all? Whether the early imperial the Roman legion had just 120 men, right? We know it's likely so, but why couldn't they be, I don't know, 100 or 150 or even lesser or larger numbers depending on the situation? And consider in this regard, once again, there is no logical reason for which this couldn't happen, right? You have to be reason, common terms in this regard. It's this prefix, standardized, categorical, wargamistic, mechanistic idea that the armies have always to be one way. There's never been a single army in the history of mankind as being equal to another. Not even one. Never, ever happened, right? And this were still pre-industrial times in many ways. There were mechanisms that varied wildly in many ways. But let's say that a possible explanation in general to this very visible numerical increase of cavalry in the Roman army resides exactly in the fact that the autonomous cavalry contingents were constituted by collecting mounted vexillations, because, by the way, vexillations could be also of infantrymen. Always keep that in mind. Of frontier units, according to the modalities that were already commonly used for infantry, right? And to fuel this praxis in an adequate manner to the new requests, it was necessary that the legions, that differently from the ally or cohortes equitatae, right, or ally or cohortes equitatae, had up to that point owned a very reduced mounted component, had now an adequate composition to provide with greater facility and frequency cavalry detachments to be employed to that specific aim, right? Which could happen more or less like this. If you take a legion of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century AD, let's say, this had a small cavalry organic that could be sent to form this vexillatio equitum, right? This cavalry could come also from the auxiliaries, of course, a cohortes equitata quingenaria or a cohortes equitata miliaria. You know that the cohortes equitatae were essentially, this mixed units of cavalry and infantry, right? But this could happen also from, detachment of an ala miliaria, right? So a cavalry with 1,000 cavalrymen, or an ala quingenaria, so with 500 cavalry. And the same goes exactly for the Roman legion of the time of Gallienus, that had probably greater number already by itself of cavalry, as we have seen, than in previous times, and that could be simply detached to the vexillatio equitum. So it's from all these combinations that the vexillationes were created, right, for this contingent need. Right, was primarily a strategic and tactical one in the medius. It didn't correspond to a broader reform of the Roman army as such. And as an ulterior effect of the growing need of mobile forces constantly on the field, these cavalry contingents began to be systematically consolidated in self-standing mounting units and provided properly with a new status, right, within the Roman army. That is, that the vexillationes were thus created were rendered autonomous in a definitive way from their own units of origin, right, to whom they were not restituted anymore the respective vexillationes. This is interesting because you understand that it happened probably just because of need, but eventually it grew to be a permanent situation, right? Let's assume a vexillatio was sent, 500 kilometers away because it was needed in that sector, and then in the meanwhile, they managed to crush an invasion, but the current emperor was killed. These guys had to fight, maybe even with their own army of origins from the other side. There were other overthrows, other units were wiped out, maybe the ones of origin, right? So you can imagine that at a certain point there were all these detachments that were fundamentally on their own, right, and had to be considered as such, as proper units of the army, right, and to be provided with a specific, command and administrative recognition of some sort. So this was a very gradual process, right? And in fact, we cannot even understand for this phenomenon a precise chronological process, right? We don't know when it, we can have an idea of when it intensified, but not really when it even started in the first place, because as we've explained, these are things that began from normal necessity of every army, but that definitely during the 3rd century, during this major period of crisis and upheavals and invasions and civil wars, etc., the thing properly was felt more evidently. And however, it was a natural, right, and gradual transformation. Yet once again, it's meaningful, the fact that it's exactly around the reign of Gallienus starts to appear in the epigraphical sources new types of cavalry units that are generically called as equites, right? So as knights, that sided the traditional ally, if you prefer, the spread of which would be generalized in the following century. So this is interesting because it makes you understand that while the ala existed as a unit, a cavalry unit of auxiliaries on its own, these equites in here, that was the traditional name which the Romans called their own cavalry, right? And properly, cavalry in general, actually, but within the Roman and even society, the equites was the class of knights that corresponded to certain senses and so on. Now, the thing is different at this time. There's a lot of changes in the same Roman society, but these were, simply from a linguistical point of view, it's as if you consider the cavalry wing as a unit, and then the cavalrymen, the knights, right? So this is very important because it really makes you understand. It's as if you had, taken out these guys from somewhere just as cavalry, which fits pretty well with the same concept of the vexillatio equitum in this regard. And the evident chronological superimposability of the appearance of this new type of mounted units with the growing crystallization of the vexillationes equitum renders, leads it to hypothesize that the first constituted exactly the final status within the transformation of the latter in definitely independent units. That is, that the first units of equites were in fact the vexillationes equitum that had become self-standing units. So that you had properly now units of equites and units called, say better, units of cavalrymen that were properly the equites, right, and the ale, right, that were both cavalry units, but they, administratively speaking, came out from two different contexts. And in fact, this is important about the distinction we made before between the legionary cavalry and the auxiliaries. That there is all the problem of now the regularization of the auxiliaries. We never made a video about this, but the fact that not just, of course, since Augustan times, the auxiliary cohorts and wings and this other mixed units were properly maintained as permanently in the Roman army as such, with their own identity, their own cultures, and so on. But that now the auxiliary units were gradually becoming, aside from losing their originally ethnic character, many reasons, if anything, just in the practice of the original military specialties and so on, but now they were essentially, with the same, think about the Caracalla's edict, right? At this point, whoever was within the Roman Empire was essentially a Roman citizen / subject. So think about all the changes that meant. These are not just the guys that coming across the frontier, or simply, being subjected by the Romans and enlisting in the Roman army for getting the citizenship and so on. Right? This is something very different, and we don't have to exclude, even from here, naturally, even the troops that were keeping to come from across borders that were framed in other units regularly, but that they may have entered to be part of these ones. So this hypothetic picture that we have drawn is interpretable as a gradual but yet systematic process of split of the mounted components from the foot ones, right, from the infantry. And this is exactly what we'll actually be seeing in the following centuries in the Roman army. So that the legions, as we have seen, they were overwhelmingly infantry, plus this small complement of cavalry, and the cortes equitate, so the mixed units now were gradually disappearing as such, right? And the whole system was growing, let's say, more flexible and capable to provide now this clearly defined and more composable either infantry or cavalry units to essentially concentrate specifically the supply of mounted troops within the mobile armies, right, as the comitatus as it's forming. So these properly headquarters / armies that are also now really the center of the imperial policy in many ways, because of the general presence of general emperors were, as you know, emerging chiefly from mutinies, from civil wars, from realities were often one of the frontier, right? And that in this sense, in fact, appear invariably composed by vexillations of infantry, adque equites, stands for the aggregation of this new unit, as we've seen as the equites proper, according to this pattern, but that by the, let's say, between the second and the 4th century, let's put it in this way, could compose different units in a different way. Right? For example, there was, generally speaking, and we will have to talk about this, the reduction in size of the same legion, right? Not just from, the loss of those few cavalrymen or whatever, they had increased by the 3rd century, but properly the split of legions into smaller units, right? They were still called legions, but they were smaller of the previous one, 5,500, and so on. And this could happen as before. Like a legion could lose, for example, its cavalry component would go into a vexillatio equitum that would be called equites unit, right? And therefore remaining it was, and then being split maybe into different legions. An ala, for example, could be also reduced inside into this process, losing part of its own organic of cavalrymen that would go to another vexillatio for whatever strategical need was at the present. That would turn into equites unit. It would be thus also, different allies would remain on their own in the meanwhile. Also, a corps equitate in this regard could lose once again part or maybe even the entirety of its cavalry, making it become a vexillatio equitum, or it could give it to an ala, right? So there would be cortes equitate that would remain properly, horse corps, let's call it this way, cavalry corps that were composed just by infantrymen. It's also possible, and this would transform the corps equitate in a normal cohort or other infantry units. And meanwhile, different modalities of units making properly would take place, because not just these ones that we have just outlined, but properly, with, as we were saying before, even with, completely foreign elements coming from across the border, from whatever, from Germany, from North Africa, from everywhere, even from areas that actually, as we will see now, during the Roman Empire hadn't undergone in the meanwhile, especially in the Balkans, much of a great Romanization, and it were more warlike, but we can find the same thing in Anatolia, on other regions. And this tendency is actually brilliantly evident for the most famous documents of 150 years later, the famous Notitia Dignitatum, about which we also made a video, in pages of which, while the traditional auxiliary units of sole cavalry, the ale, keep, just like the other units of new type, for example the equites or even the cunei, as we will see on another occasion, to proliferate, right? Mixed units of cavalry and infantry result basically disappeared, right? Because the cavalry had gone just in cavalry units, infantry just in infantry units. They had been split, right? And there are just actually a pair of cortes equitate, and it's known from the late imperial sources that the 4th and 5th century legions are exclusively infantry units, right? And the relative mounted components that had been rendered independent had evolved into vexillationes equitum and in units of equites or cunei, right? And despite the Notitia Dignitatum registers many equites units, therefore witnessing the gradual spread and giving, also the possibility of studying them in the 4th, 5th century Roman army, there are still many questions about, for example, their internal structure and even about their numerical consistency. And chances are that actually they could vary wildly. With the term equites, result apparently defined different classes that are spotted at an onomastic level from a characterizing attribution that allows to make some hypotheses. For example, according to Speidel, the equites dalmate, right, so a unit typology that seems really to appear really in Gallienus time, as a matter of fact, at least from an epigraphical level, would constitute the say evolution at a independent unit state of mounted detachments coming originally from auxiliary units, right? So either ale or cortes equitate. And the origin of the dalmate attribution is debated still today, right? It's unlikely that it refers exclusively to the ethnicity of its components. If anything, because the Dalmatian ethnicity was up to that point absent into the Roman army, right? It could have difficultly, all of a sudden become so important for the recruitment. Albeit it is true that the Illyria in general, that was still detached from Dalmatia proper, was becoming, as you know, a major pool not just of soldiers and those primitive populations that had yet not been assimilated in the Roman army and were willing, differently from the others that had gentrified, to still be hired for that matter. And we talk about the Aurelian emperors as the restorers of the Roman Empire during the 3rd century crisis. So actually it could still be possible in some way. It's probably a mix of different factors, including the fact that, in fact, the reference to Dalmatia as a province could depend from the deployment of the units from which these detachments were collected, or from the area of originary stationing of the same equites dalmate once they had been constituted. And in the latter case, we would have fundamentally a cavalry contingent concentrated, at least in origin, in a very specific area within the context of a broader mobile force that is not different from a conceptual point of view, from which that has been hypothesized in Milan. So it was probably a combination of all those factors. Also this, the Dalmatian element closer to the Danubian frontier. It's actually a possibility in the way we have recalled before. But in general, it's rather the equites promoti instead that are also, widely witnessed in the Notitia Dignitatum to be generally considered, even though still at a purely hypothetical level, the development of the legionary cavalry detachment that eventually become independent, right? So there is this difference, so that probably still the legionary cavalry, the citizen force, had in origin for the beginning of these units a greater importance. Nicaise, for example, points out, over the auxiliaries, points out that the verb promovere in Latin, it was the one technically used in order to indicate the promotion of the infantrymen to legionary cavalry. And right, so as a consequence, the attribution promoti, right, would fit pretty well to define an independent unit originated from the mounted component of a legion, who naturally became legionary cavalrymen through that promotion, in fact. And a rather similar origin has been hypothesized for the equites stablesiani, the units of which, according to Speidel, would have been constituted by stratores, that is, chosen legionaries, and used as bodyguards of the provincial governors under the command of a tribunus stabuli. This and other new equites units, for example the equites scutari, were cited to the mounted ethnic elite troops that were not framed in any traditional type of Roman unit, right? And this is important to stress, as there were these foreigners coming from areas that had always gravitated around the empire, providing very fine troops, for example, and that already from a consistent time were individuated with through a similar onomastic typology. For example, the equites Mauri, right, Moorish cavalry, that since decades, if not more, actually, they figured in the imperial comitatus, such as some units of Osroenian archers that might have actually evolved into the equites Sagittari eventually. And in line of principle, Gallienus' cavalry contingents probably didn't differ in a radical way from the ones of his predecessors. It is, however, plausible that some mechanisms that up to that point were randomly used and with very different modalities, such as the consolidation of the vexillationes equitum in independent units, had been adopted by Gallienus with a certain regularity, or a continuity, a systematic organization, and with a more defined characterization, right? Probably in this, if it ever happened, properly consisted the real reform of Gallienus cavalry. And these aspects are, by the way, also apparently coherent with what is being generally considered like a further innovation of Gallienus, that is the unification at the administrative level of all cavalry under a sole commander, right? A figure of great prestige and relevance, right? At least two of Gallienus' successors on the imperial throne actually came from a similar role, Claudius II and Aurelian themselves, right? Zonaras, in the context of Gallienus' reign, calls Aurelius commander of all cavalry, and it is known that after Gallienus' death, the unified command of cavalry remained administratively separated from the one of infantry, at least for some time. Zosimus, in fact, referring to the facts of 269 with Claudius II, emperor at that point, refers of disagreements at a tactical and strategical level between cavalry and infantry. That is, to witness the split of the command of the two, while the same Claudius, according to the Historia Augusta Vita Aureliani 18:1, would have eventually appointed Aurelian commander of cavalry. So this is a coherent pattern. And the second bigger question that is generally debated about Gallienus' army is the existence, or less, of a precise choice into confer to his mobile forces that character of permanence that seems to shine sometimes through the sources, like, with the usurpations that were ongoing in the West and in the East. Think about the Gallic Empire or the Palmyrene Empire, etc. In the scarce decade in which he reigned alone, at least, but still, since the time of Septimius Severus, still the one that ruled the longest at that point, Gallienus controlled with difficulty Italy, the Danubian provinces, and Africa. And within this territory, aside from the contingent stationed in Milan, are also witnessed other concentrations of mobile troops. There are witnessed, for example, at an epigraphical level, in strategic positions behind the frontier. And however, each one of such concentration can be easily put in relation with a specific context of crisis, I would say, at a local level, that can be therefore motivated as a measure adopted in response to contingent situations without supposing necessarily preemptive planning, and especially on a global scale. Like the Roman army didn't have this level of centralized command, right? It was a very complex system, and more or less every province, especially at this point, was operating with the ways it deemed necessary. We have actually a list of these major areas were Lycidnus, Sirmium, and Petovium, right? There was the areas of assignation of each vexillatio. So at Lycidnus, vexillatio was formed from units of the 3rd Legion Augusta and the 2nd Parthia that respectively came from Numidia and Italy. In Sirmium, there were probably even larger amount of troops coming from the 1st Legion Minervia, the 30th Ulpia, the 8th Augusta, the 22nd Primigenia, the 2nd Augusta, the 20th Valeria, and the 6th Victrix. The first 3 pairs coming respectively from Germania Inferior, Germania Superior, and Britannia Superior. The 6th Victrix from Britannia Inferior. From Petovio actually were 2 vexillationes. The first one was composed from units coming from the 10th Legion Gemina, the 14th Gemina, the 1st Adjutrix, the 2nd Adjutrix, and they were coming from Pannonia, essentially, or from the 2 Pannonia, while the 2nd Petovius vexillatio came from units of the 5th Legion Macedonica, the 13th Gemina, both stationed in Dacia. Right. For what concerns instead the choice of Milan, for example, according to Zosimus, the strategic aims were the surveillance of the secessionist activity of Postumus, that was ruling at that point on the so-called Imperium Galliarum. It was a detachment that never actually was not properly secessionist. It recognized the empire. It just wanted to be a thing on its own. The Gallic prefecture was incredibly powerful at that point. Was actually checking the Rhine frontier on its own. Right. The further reason being the control of the Alemanni that Gallienus would crush, as we remember before, and that by 260 had reoccupied the Agri Decumates, right? These areas today is chiefly Swabia in Germany, and that had in fact threatened very closely Italy from the north, and both of these threats were very concrete, and as a response, the cavalry force was, very spot on because, of the thick presence of Celts and Germans from one side in Postumus' army, as we know from the Historia Augusta, from the Vita Gallieni, 7-1, and also for the remarkable equestrian capacity of the Alemanni, according to Aurelius Victor, that justified an adequate presence in loco of the commander of all cavalry, right? But not just for this reason, by the way. And no element seems to, to show that Gallienus had effectively an intention to create any, let's say, steady or permanent strategic reserve, nor that there was a systematic or sort of grand strategy behind the positioning of his mobile troops that were detached with specific and temporally limited strategic aims. Right? So the Milanese strategic reserve was a very contingent measure. Right? Not even the presence in Aurelian's army of Equites, Dalmate, and Mauri, right, during the clashes with the Palmyrenes in 272, necessarily proves the persistence of a particular mobile cavalry contingent created by Gallienus. As you know, this mention from the side of Zosimus is perfectly in line with the ones of other sources regarding the frequent presence of units of this typology in the 3rd century Comitatus. Right, so habitually there were already these cavalry units in the Roman army that had already been put together, right, and fighting against peoples who made use of cavalry on a regular base, and some actually coming from the same ranks that the Romans, collected these troops from. And furthermore, the constant and relatively uniform presence in the Notitia Dignitatum of numerous units of Equites among the Limitanae of the provinces where the frontier system still appears at the end of 4th century as echoing the typical patterns of the late 3rd, right, suggests that many mounted units of that type eventually present in Gallienus' mobile forces had to be gradually redistributed along the limites, not much after his death by Aurelianus, or more probably by Diocletian. Right? So we have a very interesting pattern here that reveals, I think, pretty clearly what was going on overall in terms not just of the increase of cavalry forces in the Roman army together with a necessary infantry complement, but more specifically the creation of dedicated mono-arm units that were framed under the command of a specific, in fact, think about how it will evolve later into the Magister Militum and the Magister Equitum, right? And therefore the split of these two arms for an administrative purpose. Also, we see how in Gallienus' times, probably the emperor didn't quite think of a major military form of any kind, but just stationed troops in order to check certain specific threats, and how the imperial comitatus already employed on a regular base cavalry units that were coming across the border to constitute their mobile cavalry corps, right, in one of the most complicated, actually, situations of the empire that the empire had ever found itself into. However, we will keep talking about this general gradual transformation over time, right? And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.